Let me share a life-changing experience that happened during my month-long vacation in Italy. It all started on the charming island of Sicily, where I was completely smitten by the stunning local Italian. Our romance began with the fact that our paths crossed in a small, charming cafe, where she kindly treated me to a delicious breakfast. From the moment our eyes met, there was a magical connection between us, and I was looking forward to every morning when we would meet. Despite the fact that my nerves were giving out, I purposefully tried to come to the cafe every day for a week just to chat with her. But one fateful day, relying on my newfound courage and an unshakable desire to penetrate deeper into her world, I gathered my strength and took the next step. I was thrilled when she agreed to go on an official date with me, and it seemed to me that all my dreams were coming true. Our first romantic evening together was just amazing. To make a lasting impression, I decided to invite her to the most elite restaurant in the city. Throughout the evening, we had deep conversations and really got to know each other. Despite the fact that English was not her mother tongue, we managed to establish a deep connection unlike anything I had experienced before. Over time, we began to cherish every free moment, plunging into many activities and exciting adventures. Against the background of our shared experiences, she confided in me, telling me about her difficult experience. She said that in childhood she experienced a tragedy, having lost her parents at an early age, and was mercifully accepted by her elderly aunt, who became the only family person for her. Unfortunately, my aunt recently passed away, leaving her a modest house and a modest inheritance to maintain a simple but fulfilling life. Despite her modest lifestyle, she dreamed of exploring the world and, if fate allows, meeting love in a foreign country. When I listened to her heartfelt story, I was seized with a strong desire to protect her and help her realize her dreams. In my heart, I realized that I wanted to be the person who would be next to her and make these dreams come true. And 2 nights before my scheduled departure, an impulsive decision came to me. Under the enchanting, starry sky, I plucked up the courage and asked her the deepest question: "Will you marry me?" To my great delight, she sincerely accepted my spontaneous offer. Without delay, we decided to exchange vows the next day in a cozy local church. Despite the fact that our wedding was modest, she radiated a huge amount of love and pure happiness. And although I was happy that I married the woman of my dreams, sadness crept into my heart from the realization of the impending separation. But I reassured her, assuring her that I would start the visa process, and we would meet soon and start a new story of our life together. I said goodbye to Sicily with tears in my eyes, driven by an unwavering determination to speed up the process of returning my beloved wife from abroad. As soon as I set foot on my native land, my desire to connect with her and build a life together made me apply to the embassy. Having outlined our unique circumstances and my fervent desire to begin the visa process, I found solace in the encouraging support of the embassy. Shortly after that, a complete set of questionnaires was sent to my wife to fill out. But I soon realized that the road ahead would not be without difficulties. To my surprise, I soon realized that I had underestimated the difficulty and thoroughness of the visa application process, faced with unforeseen difficulties that I had not expected. The simple path I had imagined suddenly turned out to be confusing, and I couldn't help but reproach myself for being naive. Having decided to overcome these obstacles, I immediately contacted my wife and told her by phone and email about the complex forms. There was joy and readiness in her voice, and she promised that she would fill everything out at the first opportunity. I didn't know that our once smooth path could take an unexpected and stormy turn. As the days passed, an uneasy silence reigned in our communication. All attempts to contact her by phone and by text messages remained unanswered, which increased my sense of panic. Worrying about her, I decided to send a sincere message in which I expressed my concern and the urgency of the situation. I made it clear that if I didn't get a response from her within the next 24 hours, I would board the next flight to Italy. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, her voice was shaking with tears when she called me back. Sobbing tearfully, she began to talk about the difficult events that had happened to her in recent days. Her uncle from Rome, burdened with the weight of an oncological diagnosis, turned to her with a desperate request for financial assistance to carry out the treatment he needed. Despite her modest income and limited savings, she stubbornly sought a solution to the problem, feeling completely helpless in the face of exorbitant medical expenses. As she poured out her heart, surprise flashed through my mind. She had never mentioned her uncle and his illness before. At that moment, I dismissed the thoughts that she had previously said that she did not have a family, realizing that now was not the time for such questions. Instead, I focused on calming her crying and telling her that she should have trusted me from the start. As her husband, I was obliged to give her support and help in a difficult moment. Overwhelmed with gratitude, she said how lucky she was to have me by her side, thereby emphasizing the depth of her appreciation for my presence in her life. I asked about the cost of treatment, and, to my surprise, she named an exorbitant amount. For a moment I was speechless, and she anxiously called my name, fearing that I had abruptly interrupted the conversation. But I reassured her that I was still present at the conversation, although I was momentarily shocked by an unexpectedly significant amount. She further explained that the exorbitantly high cost includes not only the treatment itself, but also the costs associated with her forced trip to accompany and support her uncle. Reluctantly, I accepted this reality. Feeling sympathy and a desire to alleviate her suffering, I agreed to transfer money to her bank account, as I could not calmly observe her suffering, and sought to provide all possible assistance. She once again expressed her deep gratitude to me, but after finishing our conversation, I suddenly realized that I'd forgotten to ask about the status of her visa. 2 days later, alarmed again by the lack of communication, I dialed her number. To my great relief, she quickly replied, calming my fears and informing me that she had arrived safely to her uncle. In addition, she informed me that she had successfully organized the treatment of her uncle, which indicates that progress is evident. But when I asked how things were going with the processing of her visa, she began to deny it and explained that due to the circumstances, she could not devote much time to this. Although she was worried, I decided at that moment not to insist on it, realizing the seriousness of her situation. Despite the difficulties and uncertainties that had arisen, we continued our regular conversations, which usually lasted about half an hour. During these conversations, she diligently informed me about the course of my uncle's treatment and his general well-being. Despite the fact that I tried to provide her with all possible support and understanding, in the depths of my soul, I could not leave the feeling of anxiety associated with this whole situation. A few days passed, and she turned to me again, this time with a request for additional financial assistance. She explained that additional examinations should be carried out in the hospital to determine the extent of the lesion, and I, not having medical knowledge, could not give a clear answer to this question. Nevertheless, an uneasy feeling of doubt intensified in me, pushing aside my ability to fully understand medical subtleties. Despite my doubts, I transferred additional funds to her account, desperately hoping that this would ease her uncle's suffering. In response, she showered me with fervent words of love and repeated that she fervently wished to see me in my native country, imagining a future in which we could finally begin our life together. She promised that as soon as her uncle's treatment was over, she would immediately board the next flight to join me and establish a life together. Despite the fact that her words gave at least some semblance of comfort, uncertainty continued to be present in my thoughts. As doubts and suspicions continued to cast a shadow over our plans, a feeling of distrust grew in me. Depressed by the growing uncertainty, I sought solace in the presence of close friends. With a heavy heart, I confided in them, telling them about the complex details of the situation and especially focusing on the fact that I was worried about my wife's unexpected connection with her uncle, whom she had never mentioned before throughout our acquaintance. My friend, endowed with wisdom and insight, listened carefully to me, providing support and offering a fresh look at the situation. My astute friend, realizing the possibility of deception, quickly reacted, sensing the suspicious nature of the circumstances. He advised me to check my wife's loyalty and honesty. Taking his advice to heart, I plucked up the courage and prepared for the upcoming difficult conversation. The next day during our dialogue, I gathered all my strength to touch on this delicate topic. With a sinking heart, I carefully touched on the topic of a video chat with her uncle. Choosing my words carefully, I expressed my sincere desire to finally meet the only family member I have yet to meet, emphasizing the importance of this connection in my life. With sincere intentions, I conveyed to her my heartfelt wishes regarding the treatment of her uncle and a sincere desire to convey greetings. With every fiber of my being, I longed for an open and honest answer from her, desperately trying to dispel the disturbing doubts that plagued my thoughts. But her instant reaction destroyed my hopes. Instead of meeting my words with calm understanding, she quickly went on the defensive, vehemently protesting against my request. She firmly and emphatically stated that her uncle categorically refuses to communicate with anyone in his current weakened state. A sharp defensive position caused a flurry of alarm signals in my mind, which increased my fears. Having decided to get to the truth, I stubbornly tried to convey to her the sincerity of my intentions. With gentle reminders, I emphasized the importance of our relationship. As a husband and life partner, I asked her to recognize the importance of transparency and openness in our relationship. She abruptly said that she would take care of the financial costs of her uncle's treatment if I thought badly of her. But the conversation quickly turned into a sharp quarrel, and the tension between us began to be felt over the phone line. We exchanged harsh words. None of us wanted to give in. Suddenly, in the midst of our tense conversation, she abruptly interrupted it, leaving me at a loss and without words. My thoughts swirled in a whirlwind of bewilderment, leaving me feeling disoriented. It was a striking departure from the affectionate and grateful woman I was used to, from a woman I considered my life partner. The intensity of our argument and her unexpected defensive reaction only reinforced my suspicions that there was some deep-seated problem in our relationship, and fueled the doubts lurking in the back of my mind. Hoping for some clarity, I decided to give her a few days, waiting to see if she would get in touch again. After 4 days, she still got in touch and apologized for abruptly interrupting the conversation and not getting in touch earlier. She admitted that the last few days have made her realize how much she relies on me, and admitted that I have been her firm support throughout this difficult ordeal. There was a deep longing in her words, indicating that she misses me very much. At that moment, I caught a glimpse of the woman I fell in love with, albeit very weakly. Inspired by a sudden surge of determination, I impulsively suggested the idea of coming to her, offering to board the next flight, wanting to end all my doubts and worries. And again, the conversation went in an unexpected direction. She insisted that I should mind my own business, and emphasized her preoccupation with taking care of my uncle, expressing her unwillingness to burden me even more. When I heard her answer, I felt stunned and disappointed. Firmly believing that we should overcome life's difficulties together as a team, I expressed my disappointment and assured her that her worries are also my worries. But my words seemed to provoke her anger again. At the moment when it felt like a sudden blow, she accused me of being too persistent and selfish, especially when you consider that all the financial expenses for the treatment of her so-called uncle fell on me. The realization of this fact struck me like lightning. I've reached a breaking point. It became clear to me that it was necessary to reveal the truth about her behavior and underlying problems. With a sudden surge of determination, a plan formed in my head faster than I could realize it. Keeping calm, I sincerely apologized for causing her suffering and said I would leave her alone. But before ending the conversation, I asked if she needed additional financial assistance. As expected, she confirmed that she was needed, explaining that the funds were needed to pay for medicines. As expected, this time she requested the largest amount. Taking a calculated risk, I made a decision that took even myself by surprise. I informed her that I would transfer the money to her within 3 days, given that we are talking about a significant amount. At the same time, I clarified that for authorization, she must tell me the name of the bank in her city, as well as the date and time of collection. Surprisingly, she did not ask a question, but On the contrary, was glad that I was ready to provide her with the desired funds. Without hesitation, she readily gave me the address and the specific time of receipt. At the same time, she did not suspect what kind of plan I had developed. She had no idea that I was going to go to Italy, find her at the bank, and follow her to her place of residence unnoticed. The determination to get to the truth forced me to move forward, and a few days later I was back in Italy. Driven by an overwhelming need to get answers, I calmly settled down near the bank where, according to her, she was going to get the money, keeping vigilance and caution. Trying to be inconspicuous, I positioned myself so as not to attract attention to myself. Anxious anticipation gripped me in anticipation of her arrival. My heart was pounding from a powerful mixture of apprehension and determination. The time seemed to drag on endlessly until finally I saw her enter the bank. Overcome by curiosity and a desire to get answers to questions, I followed her every step. 15 agonizing minutes passed, and now she left the bank. A storm of emotions was reflected on her face, indicating the tension of the situation. I watched carefully as she quickly took out her phone and urgently dialed a number, apparently trying to contact me. At the same time, my phone rang, and her name appeared on the screen, but I deliberately decided not to answer. Instead, I received an SMS message from her, in which she informed me that the bank did not know about her visit in order to receive money from my account. I saw her anger building, and I saw her quickly make another call, and her impatience grew within just 5 minutes. When a car pulled up to her, I was overwhelmed by a wave of disappointment. A handsome young Italian man got out of the driver's seat, and time stood still for a moment. My eyes witnessed a scene that destroyed my sense of trust. They kissed passionately, leaving me in a state of shock. My gaze settled on the man, his expectant eyes silently demanding an explanation. She made a gesture towards the bank, as if to justify herself. Apparently, to give an explanation, she entered into a heated conversation with a man, as evidenced by the tense body language and fleeting manifestations of anger. In the end, they both got into his car, the engine of which roared and quickly drove away, leaving me with a storm of emotions. Driven by a powerful mixture of anger, betrayal, and an unquenchable thirst for answers, I made a firm decision to pursue their car. Time seemed to drag on endlessly as I followed them without losing my resolve. With unwavering determination, I continued to follow them until their car stopped near a modest, inconspicuous house. Holding my breath, I watched their synchronized steps approaching the entrance. Taking advantage of a minute's pause, I gathered my thoughts, preparing for the disturbing truth that awaited me. Deep down, a nagging intuition told me that there was something unkind in the bank. I mentally prepared myself for the worst-case scenario, but the shock still echoed in my mind, leaving me in a daze for a moment, a deep sense of betrayal that pierced the very core of my being. It was inconceivable. How stupid I had been to rush into marriage with a man I barely knew. I cursed my romantic tendencies and wished I had been more careful. But amid the waves of regret, I realized that dwelling on the past was an unacceptable luxury. It was a moment that required action. Watching the passionate embrace of my supposed wife kindled a fire in me, in which anger, resentment, and determination burned. Nevertheless, a surge of adrenaline was necessary to move forward and fulfill the plan. I longed for anger to grow in me, and without getting out of the car, I dialed her number. After a minute, she answered, wasting no time, and told about the situation she was in at the bank. Suppressing my emotions, I put on a semblance of self-control and began to apologize in a calm, collected voice for the mistake I made. By assuring her that I would contact the bank first thing in the morning and correct the mistake, I managed to calm her down for a while. In search of additional information, I inquired about her whereabouts, knowing full well that she would most likely deceive me. The picture that unfolded in front of me was an absolute mess. There was tension in the air and a heavy smell of deception. Ignoring all caution, I was confronted with her lies, with her made-up story that she was in the hospital with her uncle. The weight of the accumulated lies became unbearable. Anger heated up to the limit. Inspired by inexorable determination, I got out of the car and walked resolutely to the house. My steps sounded purposeful. Fortunately, the dilapidated state of the house played into my hands. With 2 attempts, I managed to force the door down. The door swung open with a deafening crash, revealing a picture that shattered all remaining illusions. As if electrocuted, they jumped up from their seats in the living room, expressing surprise and incomprehension. Driven solely by a sense of anger and betrayal, I acted without hesitation. With a quick and strong movement, the fist crashed into the man's jaw, causing him to collapse to the floor, losing his senses for a moment. Against the background of the resulting disorder, my wife's sharp scream pierced the air, and then a stream of panicked Italian words burst from her lips. In the conditions of chaos, the space around me blurred, adrenaline surged in my veins, and my wife's screams became distant and indistinct. Ignoring her screams, I focused on her companion, who was struggling to get to his feet. Overcome with anger, I struck another merciless blow, knocking him to the floor with force, and his agonized moans echoed through the room. Turning my attention to my wife, I watched her desperate flight to the door, driven by fear, which prompted her to escape. Gathering my resolve, I rushed forward, quickly wrapped my arms around her waist, stopping all attempts to escape. Keeping a firm grip, I forcefully knocked her down on the sofa. From the impact, she hit the pillows. She sat down hurriedly, a powerful mixture of fear, guilt, and defiance reflected in her eyes. My every being longed to grab her hands, demand answers, force her to admit the whole horrifying truth of her actions. To rewrite this text, and yet, in the midst of the boiling anger that threatened to engulf me, I gathered all my remaining self-control. Taking a seat opposite her, I met her gaze, which burned and destroyed trust. In a voice trembling with resentment and despair, I uttered only 2 words. "Explain yourself to me." Her initial defiance was gone, leaving behind a trembling vulnerability. She looked at me like a trapped animal. There was a thick smell of her obvious fear in the air, permeating the space between us. There was a heavy silence, weighed down by the weight of her decisions and the betrayal of our sacred vows. At this crucial moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating the inevitable fight. Depressed, she finally succumbed to emotions and revealed the truth. With tears in her eyes, she confessed that she was already married, and the man lying motionless on the floor was actually her husband, with whom she had been for a 1.5 years. She spoke about their shared financial difficulties, clarifying that he was not a former prisoner. Then she told about the sad reality associated with their deplorable employment opportunities, which made it very difficult for them to make ends meet. In a shocking revelation, she admitted that they were involved in a deceptive scheme, profiting from unsuspecting tourists. She manipulated their emotions, causing a feeling of love, and then used them for financial purposes, not intending to fulfill these promises. When her words reached me, a wave of burning anger swept over me, spreading through my veins. The time, money, and trust I invested in her turned out to be completely meaningless. Disgust seized me, and I felt complete disgust. At that moment, I was overwhelmed with an acute desire to return everything I had given her. With firm determination, I demanded that she repay the debt, to which she refused, admitting that she had already spent every last penny. Desperate, I began to look around the meager surroundings in search of at least something valuable that could be used. Unfortunately, there was nothing in the house except shabby furniture and a modest TV. Meanwhile, the husband was writhing in pain, holding his side, and his moans echoed through the room. Ignoring his suffering, I took her firmly by the hand and led her to my car, and her cries of protest went unheard. She stubbornly resisted, demanding to tell about my plans, while I forced her into the passenger seat. I firmly explained to her that we were going to the police station, where I intended to get her to fully confess to the monstrous crime she had committed. I told her about the manipulation tactics she used to drag me into a fictitious marriage, and then use me for her own selfish purposes, being married to another man. Wanting to emphasize the consequences of not fulfilling her demands, I issued a stern warning, promising to bring down torrents of misfortune on her and her husband. The The seriousness of my threat seemed to have a strong effect on her, probably because she had seen firsthand my behavior in their house. I'm not usually prone to violence and conflict, but the scale of betrayal has awakened a dark and vindictive side in me. Consumed by a thirst for retribution, I wanted to unleash my anger on her husband and wreak havoc in their home. But common sense suggested that they did not deserve the consequences that such actions could lead to, including criminal records. Quickly finding the nearest police station on Google Maps, I silently drove in his direction, and she quietly sobbed next to me. When she tried to beg me, I abruptly silenced her, refusing to lie further. The process at the police station took several hours, during which I gave detailed testimony, gave convincing evidence, gave incriminating photos from our wedding day, as well as text messages in which she shamelessly asked for money for her sick uncle. The weight of the evidence against her was undeniable. As a result, she was convicted and, together with her hapless husband, suffered a heavy punishment in the form of a criminal record. That same evening, I made the decision to leave the country, deciding to leave this stormy ordeal in the past. Reflecting on the experience, I swore that I would take it as a lesson, as a reminder that one should never rush into marriage or make commitments. If something seems too perfect, then it's probably too good to be true.
I am a 40-year-old woman. My husband is 42 years old. We got married when I was 22 and he was 23. Our marriage has been wonderful so far. We have a 12-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son. But lately, I've had a strange feeling that my husband might be in love with my sister. My sister, who is 43 years old, has always disliked me. Although she was our parents' favorite when we were growing up, I was constantly confronted with her deep hostility towards me when she constantly deprived me of what was dear to me. I remember a case when I enjoyed playing football in my youth and achieved great success in this. My sister, not knowing what to do, found out about my hobby and decided to join him, despite the fact that she did not surpass me in skill, so to speak. Unexpectedly, the day came when the sister, unfortunately, suffered an ankle injury. It was completely unfair that she shifted the blame onto my shoulders by inventing a story that she shared with our trusting parents. Unfortunately, they believed her, and the bias clouded their minds. As a result, a harsh sentence was passed forbidding me to continue playing football, despite the fact that I am not guilty of anything. Moreover, she began to dominate my personal life, taking away my first boyfriend and subjecting me to constant bullying at school. But I decided to suffer in silence, preferring to keep my feelings a secret. Recently, I have had an uneasy intuition hinting that my husband may have romantic feelings for my sister. This suspicion intensified when my sister went through a divorce and immediately turned to my husband for help, who readily agreed without a moment's hesitation. This pattern of behavior has persisted throughout our lives. When she needs his support, he is always there, putting her needs above all else. About 2 months ago, an unpleasant incident occurred when our 12-year-old daughter received a broken arm. My husband and I rushed to the hospital, unanimously worried about her well-being. Meanwhile, our son was happily spending time visiting his friend. Returning home, my daughter, eager to taste food from McDonald's, asked me to bring it to her as she really wanted to. In addition, she wanted her father to be there, since their relationship had always been especially close. When I arrived with the required food, a depressing sight awaited me. My husband was leaving, and my daughter tearfully begged him to stay by her side. Alarmed and wanting to understand the situation, I hurried to approach them and demand an explanation. To my horror, he said that he was going to my sister, who was supposedly ill. This revelation caused me a feeling of deep disappointment and anxiety. Expressing my disappointment and concern, I questioned his decision to give preference to the needs of his sister over the recent trauma of our daughter. His answer brought no consolation. He only said that his sister needed his presence, after which he quickly left. This indignantly outraged me and caused a surge of anger. Feeling a sense of self-preservation and the need to protect my children, I quickly packed things for myself, my daughter, and our son. Deciding to distance ourselves from the turmoil, we found shelter in my aunt's house. She was the only family member who understood my sister's problems and was a reliable shelter during my growing up. But 2 days later, an urgent need forced me to return home, as I inadvertently forgot my work computer. What awaited me upon arrival home plunged me into shock. I could not comprehend the picture that unfolded before my eyes. When I entered our family home, it was with a sinking heart that I saw my husband and sister sitting closely on the couch and doing an unacceptable thing that should not have happened in any way. Stunned by my unexpected appearance, they hurriedly cleaned themselves up, trying to hide their actions. In a desperate attempt to save the situation, my husband rushed to me, pleading that it was a misunderstanding and insisting that everything was not as it seems. Overwhelmed with shock, resentment, and anger, I could no longer contain my emotions. I raised my voice, asking how he could betray our sacred bonds in such a way, and expressing my sense of insignificance. The words turned into a torrent of pain and resentment when I announced my desire to divorce. Unable to bear the severity of the situation any longer, I hurriedly left the house to go to my aunt's house. In a state of complete despair, I sought shelter in the room where I temporarily lived. Tears flowed uncontrollably. Overcome by a sense of deep loss, I found myself at a crossroads, not knowing what to do next. Despite the fact that I asked my aunt to keep the situation a secret, she has already managed to share this sad news with our parents and numerous relatives. From this contradictory revelation, I felt both chagrin and relief, since I did not have the strength to resist them myself. Amid this horror, my husband and sister inundated me with a barrage of text messages, desperately demanding a conversation. Despite their requests, I preferred to ignore them, not knowing how to cope with the violent emotions that gripped me. One of the pressing problems that weighs on my heart is how to tell this terrible news to my children, because their innocent souls should be protected from the pain and shocks that have now engulfed our family. After a while, the situation remains unresolved, and I continue to struggle with the overwhelming emotions and uncertainty that accompany this painful chapter of my life. Conflicting emotions raged in me. One part was filled with sadness, thoughts of forgiving my husband for the sake of our children, and the other was boiling with anger, thirst for revenge. I began to tell the children that everything was not going smoothly at work, attributing my sadness to this since I could not summon the courage to reveal their father's act. I'm sorry I didn't mention this earlier, but my sister was married to a surprisingly attractive and genuinely kind ex-husband. Their marriage ended in divorce because of the constant mental pressure she exerted on him, and which eventually turned into physical. This led to the fact that he made the difficult decision to break off the relationship. Unfortunately, due to her manipulative nature, she resorted to creating a false version, accusing her husband of aggression and spreading false information. Trying to understand the situation, I turned to her ex-husband with a proposal to hold a conversation and discuss possible ways to restore justice. After careful consideration, he agreed, and we agreed to meet at a public cafe to discuss possible options. During the conversation, we found out the extent of her abusive behavior and even touched on his suspicions about her feelings for my husband. I told about what I saw, and together we decided to start implementing our plan of retaliation. First of all, we turned to the authorities with a statement that the sister had committed an offense. The police were skeptical at first, but soon recognized the validity of our claims, supported by such physical evidence as visible bruises and threatening messages. Having assured us of their readiness to conduct the case, they advised us to contact a lawyer. I decided to transfer all funds from our shared account to my personal account and took steps to evict him from the house since he was in my property. Having resorted to the services of a lawyer, I began the divorce process, knowing full well that it would be a difficult and long struggle. But my determination to get rid of this toxic person spurred me on, and I was ready to do whatever it took. A few days later, I gathered my children and plucked up the courage to tell them the truth. My son reacted with anger, which is understandable. But my daughter remained skeptical and accused me of cheating. I reassured her that despite her doubts, my intentions were honest and sincere, and asked her to believe in my words. I made it clear that I did not intend to prevent my daughter from communicating with her father. But, to my surprise, when I returned from work that day, I found that guests had unexpectedly gathered. My parents, my husband's parents, my sister, and my aunt gathered. Completely unaware of this scenario, I was stunned by the situation. It turned out that my aunt had reached the point where she broke off relations with her sister and decided to tell the whole family the truth about what I had witnessed. In addition, she said that her sister had problems with the law and her aunt helped her avoid prison every time. My parents were overcome with anger, their voices rising in a chorus of frustration directed at her. In a moment of strong emotions, my mother even resorted to a strong slap in the face, accompanied by words expressing their desire to break off relations with her forever. As for my husband's parents, they were full of disbelief, expressing their shock at his act, not understanding how he could stoop to such baseness. This feeling was especially acute when you consider that his mother selflessly raised him in a single-parent family before meeting his stepfather, whom he affectionately called his dad. In the midst of this tense atmosphere, my daughter boldly rose to her feet. There was a fierce dislike for her father in her voice when she expressed her emotions. My daughter firmly said that she would never want to look at her father again, and there was a deep sense of disappointment in her words. Filled with anger and resentment, she rushed upstairs to the room she shared with her brother in my aunt's house and forcefully closed the door behind her. My son, wearing a mask of disappointment, cast a wistful glance at his father and silently followed his sister up the stairs. Meanwhile, my husband was on his knees in front of me and, in a voice trembling with remorse, asked me for forgiveness. I gave him a 2-day ultimatum and told him to pack up and leave the house, stressing that if his demands were not met, I would contact the authorities. Overwhelmed with despair, he began to sob, begging me and desperately admitting that he had nowhere else to go. His parents made it clear that he was not welcome in their home. I stood my ground firmly, not backing down from my decision and seeking a divorce. After a heartfelt and emotional conversation, he agreed and left with tears in his eyes. 2 days later, I returned home with my children, who were absent from school after our conversation. They were visibly worried, especially my daughter. Having gathered them closer, I sat them down and hugged them, making it clear that we are a strong team and together we will cope with this task, no matter what obstacles arise. I made a solemn promise to always be there for them. Overwhelmed with emotions, they both burst into tears, and we remained in these tender embraces until they found comfort in a dream. After that, I woke up my children and gently put them in their beds. Then I went down the stairs, feeling a load of emotions falling on me. It was very important for me to protect the children from how much I was worried. For their sake, I had to remain steadfast. Suddenly, the doorbell rang in the house, and I decided that my ex-husband was standing on the threshold. To my surprise, it turned out to be my sister's ex-husband, who came with an unexpected visit. When tears flowed down my face, he hugged me comfortingly, realizing that I was in a difficult loneliness. He kindly decided to stay the night and, waking up, thoughtfully prepared breakfast for me and my children. When my children talked to him, it was clear that they were glad of his presence. He invited them to go on an adventure in a unique place, and although they hesitated at first, his convincing charm won them over. They hurriedly scattered to prepare. Overwhelmed with gratitude, I thanked him from the bottom of my heart, responding to his embrace. It is worth noting that my sister's ex-husband has always maintained a close relationship with my children. As soon as they left, I immediately contacted my lawyer for an important conversation before the scheduled meeting. Upon returning home, what unfolded before my eyes almost brought me to tears. When I entered the living room, I immediately noticed Thomas, who was sitting on the sofa and eating his favorite food. My daughter was sitting next to him, her eyes swollen and reddened from tears. I silently took off my shoes and jacket, allowing a smile to decorate my face. My son, overcome with delight, rushed to me and embraced me in a heartfelt embrace. We sat down at the table together, finding solace in each other's presence at this difficult time. After a meal together, I started a sincere conversation with my children, suggesting that they seek professional help from a psychotherapist. Thomas, who always supports me, advised them to be open-minded and give a chance, instilling in our family a sense of hope and healing. Considering that Thomas had already undergone therapy himself, I was inspired by his example and decided to turn to a specialist too. Meanwhile, my husband continued to bombard my phone with a continuous stream of messages and calls, which made me decide to block it. As a result, my children decided to stop communicating with their father, and I made a difficult choice in favor of breaking off relations with my own parents. In addition, I took a responsible step. I passed tests for sexually transmitted diseases, and fortunately, the results were negative. As for my daughter's well-being, she is doing everything possible to cope with this difficult situation. There are times when she seeks comfort, either from me or from Thomas, with tears in her eyes expressing her deep contempt for her father. There are times when my daughter seeks comfort from her father, and I do not hold it against her for this, and I never will. To see her go through such deep suffering is really heartache. All she craves is the restoration of our destroyed family, but I understand that this is an unattainable reality, since irreparable damage has already been done. At times, she has bouts of emotional depression when she seems detached from the world around her. Sometimes she involuntarily calls Thomas Daddy, which is not inherently something negative, but it's important to admit that I would never have been able to maintain a romantic relationship with my sister's ex-partner, no matter the circumstances. Whatever the extent of her misdeeds, I cannot allow the thought of the possibility of continuing a relationship with my sister's ex-partner. It's a boundary I just can't cross. As for my son, he has become emotionally withdrawn, often goes into solitude, where I sometimes find him crying in silence. I give him comfort in a warm embrace, enter into conversations that allow him to express his emotions. I stay by his side until he falls asleep, because this is the only way I can understand the depth of his feelings, given his unwillingness to openly communicate with me, despite my persistent attempts. In addition, my ex-husband severed all relations with my sister, completely ending their relationship and ending any communication. After being fired from the company of the father of my children, he managed to find a well-paid job and now lives in a cozy house. Unaware of this, he was saving money, perhaps in anticipation of the day when I would find out about his affair with my sister. My daughter takes it upon herself to inform me about these changes, but I try not to put pressure on her. She feels obligated to keep me informed of my father's life, and I respect her choice. On the other hand, my son is still estranged from his father, preferring not to communicate with him and not to visit him. I firmly believe that he can make his own decisions in this matter. Meanwhile, my ex-husband is stubbornly trying to contact me, sending flowers and gifts. In an effort to avoid extravagance, I accept these gestures, but this does not mean a desire to reconcile or continue communication. Despite everything, my love for him remains firm, and it is not easy to part with this feeling. I received information that my sister currently lives in her car and is trying to make ends meet, having a meager salary. It should be emphasized that if she turns out to be homeless, I am ready to lend her a helping hand, since the idea that she will endure the dangers of the treacherous nights of our city is unbearable. Thomas turned out to be a huge source of support for our whole family. His wonderful qualities do not leave anyone indifferent. In addition, it is worth noting that Thomas recently discovered his sexual orientation, calling himself bi. I recently got into a relationship with a man named Logan, and the impact he had on my life was truly amazing. Logan not only became an invaluable source of support for me, but also liked my children, between whom there was a real friendship. My son has genuinely fallen in love with Logan, and my daughter's love for him is growing every day. In addition, I was lucky enough to meet a person who shares my interests and hobbies, and we communicate and train together. This man ignited a familiar spark in me, reminiscent of the feelings I experienced during previous relationships. Although I am not considering the possibility of a romantic relationship with him yet, his presence brings me great joy and satisfaction. At the moment, I decided not to inform the children about new events in my personal life. That's all for now. Quite recently, I learned shocking news that seemed unthinkable to me. My sister, who lived in her car and refused to take financial help from me. Being in a desperate state, she accidentally met my ex-husband with an attractive woman at the restaurant where she worked. Apparently, she was tormented by a sense of resentment that she was in such a distressed state, and he, because of which everyone abandoned her, was walking around expensive restaurants with another woman. In a fit of anger, as I found out later, she stabbed him in the neck and ran out of the establishment. But she did not manage to hide for a long time. Literally half an hour after the terrible crime, the police caught her. An examination was also carried out on my sister's sanity, and it turned out that she was in a strong mental disorder. Before her recovery, she was placed in a psychiatric clinic, but after she regains consciousness, she will be sentenced to 13 years in prison for premeditated murder. For a total of 6 years, my husband, who is 29 years old, and I, 27 years old, have been on a joint life path, sharing 4 years of marriage. Unfortunately, in the last few years, we have faced serious problems. In particular, my husband constantly has difficulties expressing his emotions, as a result of which he is used to keeping them to himself until they inevitably spill out. Throughout our relationship, I was constantly striving for open and honest communication. But over time, I began to get tired and eventually decided to give him the space he seemed to need. Our once thriving marriage has fallen into disrepair, and we have become more like roommates than passionate partners. Although we still slept in the same bed, the flame of intimacy faded and became a rare phenomenon. Quarrels became too frequent in our communication. They arose on issues that had never been the subject of disagreement before. Doubts began to creep into my head whether our relationship could withstand this storm. The situation worsened during the pandemic, when we were constantly at home, both working remotely. The closeness and constant interaction caused by the pandemic has become a serious problem for maintaining harmony in our relations. Unintentionally, we often interfered with each other, which further increased the tension between us. When the pandemic finally ended, I felt relieved and excited at the prospect of returning to work. The opportunity to meet my work colleagues again filled me with joy and showed how much I missed their presence during the time when I was in isolation. After the first week after returning to work, I began to notice unexpected changes in our dynamics. To celebrate our resilience and the path we have traveled, we decided to celebrate this event and go to the bar for much-needed communication. 4 of my female colleagues and 2 of my male colleagues gathered at the bar, with one of whom I had a close working relationship. Working together on numerous projects helped establish strong relationships, and he himself was known for his easy and friendly nature. The offer to give him a lift to the bar seemed quite natural to me, since he preferred not to drive so as not to succumb to the temptation to drink too much. Arriving at the bar, I was completely immersed in the cheerful atmosphere, enjoying every moment. A sense of relief came over me when I got rid of the constant quarrels at home. At work, I was in close contact with a male colleague, and our camaraderie often resulted in playful teasing, for which we received the frivolous nickname husband and wife among colleagues. Subconsciously, this playful label seemed to bring me closer to him as the evening passed. For 2 years of working together, we engaged in innocent flirting, never once thinking about going beyond joking banter. But that evening, there was an inexplicable change in the air, and I had a clear feeling that something had changed between us. As we spent time together, our bond became stronger and stronger, and I could not resist the growing attraction. Driving my male colleague home, I reflected on the tangled web of feelings that entangled me. When, after our night walk, he invited me to his house to have another drink, I found myself in a difficult position. I knew that my husband was waiting for my return, but the prospect that a pleasant evening would end did not give me peace of mind. There was an undeniable attraction in the strong presence of my work colleague and his lively energy. Returning home to my husband suddenly felt like a transition from a lively holiday to a solemn event, which prompted me to attend a little more before facing reality. When we drove up to his house, I didn't expect anything intimate to happen. After all, I've been there before and nothing like this has happened. We just kept drinking and enjoying the music. We danced freely, completely immersed in each other's company. Gradually, we got to the sofa where our conversation turned to the problems in my marriage. We were both under the influence of alcohol, and the emotional vulnerability of the moment led to a spontaneous kiss and hug that crossed a line that should not have been violated. Even in this intimate case, a weak voice in the back of my mind was aware of its wrongness. I was committed to marriage, and he knew it perfectly well. But in that fleeting moment, none of us seemed to think about the consequences. The forbidden charm was intoxicating, awakening a long-dormant desire in me. In the heat of excitement, I got carried away, a thirst for thrills. But when I was driving home alone, the alcoholic haze began to dissipate, leaving behind a suffocating wave of guilt. The realization that I had betrayed my husband's trust hit me with relentless force. Remorse consumed me, my conscience gnawed at me every moment. I felt an overwhelming nausea, the heaviness of my actions. In search of solace, I ran to the shower, wanting to get rid of the guilt that hung over me like a motionless shadow. Curiously, against the background of this feeling of guilt, I realized that for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, I was sleeping peacefully. It seemed to me that in that fleeting moment, I stumbled upon a feeling of satisfaction that my husband did not even suspect. But the weight of my mistakes stayed with me throughout the weekend, haunting me at every turn. Trying to lighten this burden, I tried to compensate for it by spending time with my husband, hoping to eliminate the break in relations caused by my actions. Despite the feeling of guilt and understanding of the severity of our act, anxiety did not leave us in communication with a colleague. His manly aura and sincere smile were disarming, and it was hard to resist his charm. But as the day went on, we again plunged into the familiar picture of affectionate gestures. Our bodies seemed to be attracted to each other, unable to resist the magnetic attraction of forbidden attraction. And once again, we found ourselves in his apartment, succumbing to temptation and staying there longer than ever. The burden of guilt haunted me, haunting my every thought. Everywhere I went, a piercing cloud of gravity hung over me, casting a shadow. This behavior was completely out of character for me, and the thought that I was now engaged in deception and betrayal in marriage weighed on my conscience. It was a stark contrast to what I was before. I criticized others for similar actions, and this made my own misdeeds even more unbearable. Self-loathing consumed me. I despised my own weakness and recklessness. Finally, having gathered the courage, I gained strength and decided to end the affair with a colleague. To my relief, he agreed to part ways. But being in his presence after the termination of the novel only intensified my longing and inner conflict. Thoughts of being with him occupied my entire consciousness, despite the indisputable understanding that this is definitely wrong. The situation was further complicated by the fact that we still had to work together, which made it almost impossible to get rid of the painful temptation. As if the guilt and inner turmoil were no longer insurmountable, my husband surprised me by expressing a newfound willingness to explore the possibility of marriage counseling, a step he had never considered before. During the therapy session, an amazing transformation took place. My husband opened his heart, showing a deep love for me that I had never met from him before. He took full responsibility for his role in our marital struggle and devoted himself wholeheartedly to saving our relationship. The weight of my secret betrayal weighed heavily on me, and this weight became unbearable. Unable to bear the deception any longer, I felt that I was collapsing, and in the presence of our therapist, I found the strength to confess everything to my husband. During the difficult period of our marriage, my infidelity began, but it is important to note that it was not the root cause of our problems. After the confession of infidelity, I tried to sincerely express to my husband my remorse and chagrin that I betrayed our marital ties. I assured him that I was fully committed to our relationship and intended to rectify the situation. Having taken urgent measures to prevent further contacts with this employee, I immediately asked to be transferred to another project group, thereby eliminating the possibility of close communication with him. In just 4 months, I have taken active steps to further distance myself from the past by getting a completely new job. At the same time, we actively attended psychotherapy sessions to solve and overcome the problems facing us. To demonstrate my commitment and restore trust, I introduced an open device policy, giving my husband unlimited access to my phone and other devices without the need for explanations or suspicion. Undoubtedly, it was a difficult path, but we persevered towards the goal and came out of it even stronger and steadier. We sincerely believed that we had successfully overcome the enormous pain caused by this event and entered a new chapter in our relationship. Unfortunately, 3 months ago, the problem resurfaced during an industry conference held in our city. Considering our common professional sphere, my husband accompanied me to this event. While attending the conference, I was thrilled to see a speaker I had admired for a long time. After her informative speech, she kindly stayed to chat with the participants, and I eagerly approached her to express my deep admiration. But when I approached the speaker, I couldn't help but notice that my former colleague was already involved in a conversation with her. Feeling uncomfortable and insecure, I quickly offered my husband lunch. It is clear that he was puzzled by my sudden change of plans because he knew about my deep admiration for the speaker and urged me to approach her. I continued to brush off his words, insisting that I was hungry and would prefer to eat. My husband, perplexed about my behavior, could not understand how I could so suddenly change my attitude to meeting a man whom I had admired for a long time. Despite my attempts to dismiss and insist on lunch, my husband did not give up. He persistently questioned me about my unwillingness to approach the speaker, feeling that something was wrong. Feeling trapped and depressed, I finally plucked up the courage to reveal the truth. I confessed to my husband that the presence of my former work colleague communicating with the speaker caused me a feeling of anxiety because I made a promise to myself never to be near him again. The weight of this revelation hit her husband like a punch in the stomach, and his expression visibly changed to resentment and distrust. After such a story, my husband was uncharacteristically silent for several days. The severity of the situation greatly affected him, and he admitted that during a personal meeting with my former colleague, the betrayal became more tangible and real than words could convey. Understanding the depth of his emotions, I felt deep remorse for the pain I had caused him. Trying to make amends, I wholeheartedly offered everything that could help us heal and move on. Whether it was couples therapy, counseling, or any other means of support, I was ready to do whatever was necessary to restore our relationship and find a path to healing. At first, my husband reassured me that he was coping, but soon it became clear that something was wrong. It was shocking that he started making subtle racial remarks, especially when incidents or crimes were reported in the news, focusing on the race of the participants. This behavior was completely out of character for him and deeply disturbed me. It seemed that the pain caused by my betrayal manifested itself in a pernicious form, turning him into a person I hardly recognized. Watching these changes in him was both unpleasant and disturbing. My husband's recent behavior was completely out of character for him. Throughout our relationship, he has always demonstrated a strong rejection of discrimination and manifestations of racial hatred. But after my confession about the meeting with a former African-American colleague, his statements took an alarming turn and began to express nationalism more and more. This shocked me and caused a feeling of deep discomfort. When I finally plucked up the courage and approached him with this problem, hoping for understanding and a solution, he rejected my concerns, further increasing the tension between us. This reaction only worsened my pain and confusion. He got to the point where he crossed a deeply offensive line by using the N-word, and that was a turning point for me. During a heated argument, I rebuffed him, finally realizing that his recent behavior was a direct consequence of a meeting with my colleague at a conference. Prior to this meeting, my husband did not know what my former colleague looked like, and it seems that this unexpected meeting was the impetus for the appearance of these disturbing statements. But when I plucked up the courage to express my dissatisfaction and respond to his statements, he responded with accusations, claiming that I was taking the side of my former colleague, not him. This only worsened the emotional turmoil and confusion in our relationship. When I received this answer, I was overcome with anger because it implied that my position against nationalism meant that I was betraying my husband. The prejudices and hatred expressed were unbearable, and this made me doubt the strength of our marriage. Our relationship became strained to the point that we started sleeping in separate bedrooms. Although I thought my husband was not like that at his core, the pain I caused him seemed to distort his emotions beyond recognition. Our situation has become difficult, and we are at a turning point. We started a frank conversation about the possibility of temporary separation, seeking to reassess our emotions and rediscover the reasons that brought us together. We considered the possibility of spending 2 months apart in order to reevaluate later whether a divorce is a suitable option for our relationship. But in the interval of these 2 months, my husband filed for divorce, from which I was shocked. I tried to contact him to find out such a drastic decision, but he did not answer my calls. For 2 days, I went to work immersed in grief. On the 3rd day, I found solace in the arms of my former colleague. He supported me with emotion throughout the divorce process until it turned out that my husband and I were HIV positive. I was shocked by this news. It remained to find out who infected whom. A week later, the court forced my lover to take tests for HIV. And the worst thing is that it was he who infected me, and in the consequences, I infected my husband. I was in a desperate state when the man I trusted and cheated on my husband with him just disappeared in an unknown direction. My husband left me a beggar. I had neither housing nor the means to exist. I was supported only by a close friend. I lived with her until I found a job as a waiter because I was fired from the previous one, where I was in a good position.